This new rule hurt Kevin Durant's game. I saw an article today talking about how they are implementing a new rule this season in order to combat some of the non-basketball moves in order to draw a foul, or at least what they consider non-basketball moves. Now the thing is, like, the article said it's Kevin Durant's one of his signature moves, and he definitely does do this, but for me, I always associate it with Chris Paul. And that is the very popular or unpopular, however you look at it, rip through move. Now again, like I said, Kevin Durant does do this, and he was the headline for the article, basically, talking about how he's going to be affected. But to me, again, I associate it first and foremost with Chris Paul, and then obviously Kevin Durant and other players. The league has tried to combat rip through before, and they have implemented a rule. And I do believe that after the rule was implemented, it did go down a bit. But obviously players are still doing it. They're crafty and they figure out ways to get around it. Like, they found a loophole. So basically the new rule that's coming into this season is that any player who is trying to, basically if a defender is standing right in front of them, right, and Kevin Durant swings his arms to the right and gets contact from the defender, but he's not facing the basket, it will be deemed no foul and a play on. Whereas this season, or this past season, something like that was considered a foul, or at least it was given a foul. It's more obvious if someone creates contact and they're not facing the basket, so it's easier to tell that, it is a non-basketball move to the officials and they can call it a non-foul. But to try to make this rule more effective, it also includes when you create contact and you go in an upwards motion away from the basket. So what that means is you could be kind of facing the basket, but when you swing your arms in an upwards motion, you're directing the ball to the corner instead of towards the basket. And therefore, that is also considered a non-basketball move and no longer a foul. And I think those are going to be harder to determine because those aren't as obvious, and someone could kind of, turn their body a little bit so it looks like it's going towards the basket. So I'm sure there will be players who figure out how to get a loophole out of this, but this is the NBA's way of trying to combat that rip-through move. If the league is successful at implementing this rule and the rip-through is no longer called, will this hurt Kevin Durant's game, Chris Paul, and anybody else who attempts these kind of moves? Personally, I don't think it affects Kevin Durant's game. He's so skilled and he can shoot from anywhere on the court. He can do pretty much anything on the offensive end, can't really block a shot. He's 7 feet tall. So it was just an additional bonus that he could do that, draw fouls, get someone in foul trouble, get free throws. But other than that, he doesn't need it. He's so talented and skilled, and he can get to his spot at any time. So that's why I don't think it really affects him. Just maybe it might make his free throws, his attempts, go down a bit because that is part of how he draws fouls. In Chris Paul's case, he's in Golden State now, and they run a completely different system than when he was in Phoenix and when he was on the Clippers, and it's just completely different. And obviously they want him to, showcase some of his skills that make him who he is, which will be a bit different than the kind of plays and style of plays that they run. But I don't think he's going to be relying on the rip through. Not that he even relies on it, obviously. These players don't rely on it, but he won't be relying on it as much as in the past because he's on Golden State and he doesn't really need to do that. I would say when he was the number 1 option on his team or number 2 option, depending on how you look at it, him and Blake Griffin, those kind of teams on the Suns, when he was more of a focal point, and he will be obviously, getting important minutes, but when he was the number 1 focal point, it was more important for him to draw fouls, to get as many points as he could, because he was one of the best players on the team in order to help them win. Now that he's on Golden State, it's fair to say that he's not the first option, the second option, the third option, might not even be the 4th option in terms of scoring. So I don't think you'll see as much of that from him as in the past because they don't need him to be a scorer as much, although of course they want him to obviously have some scoring mentality. So if it was earlier in Chris Paul's career, this might affect him a little more. He would figure it out, but it might be, a bigger hindrance if you want to say that. But I feel like at this point, and especially the team he's on, I don't think it really affects him at all. If anything, it might actually affect him less than Kevin Durant because Kevin Durant is still being relied on as the number 1 option, number 2 option, however you look at it with him and Devin Booker, to be a top scorer. He has to draw fouls. He has to do all those things in order to make his team win. They are looking for him on the offensive end to score. And for Chris Paul, it's not the same, especially where he's at. I'm sure other players are going to still try to attempt it, whether or not they get the call. Maybe, maybe not. It'll be interesting to see how the officials start, calling these kind of things. And I have to say, although I'm not a fan of like the in-season tournament, which I know a lot of people are not a fan of, like some of those ideas are not my favorite. But I will say when it comes to like implementing new rules, like you can't land in the shooter's area when they would, shoot a three, and the whole Zaza, Pachulia, Kawhi Leonard rule, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know if it was actually named after them. Like I know it's from that incident, but I don't know if they actually have the name of the rule for that. But basically you can't land, in the shooter's area when they're shooting a three or whatever, or even in general, because obviously it could lead to injuries and issues, and they don't want that. They want the players to be healthy. And I will say that rule has actually worked pretty well. And to combat players like three-point shooters specifically, because usually it's on a three, from kicking their legs out and drawing a foul of a player landing in their area when they're not, they implemented the rule that you can't kick your legs out like unnaturally. There's a difference of your leg, kicking out normally because that's how you shoot, and then you kicking your leg out like you're a rocket. So like, I feel like those rules actually ended up working out pretty well in the league. Yes, there will always be issues with it. Sometimes it doesn't go as well. Like sometimes you watch and you're like, that I don't think that should have been a foul, or I think that should have been a foul. But either way, like I feel like for the most part, that rule actually ended up working out decently well. I'm not saying every single rule that the league has implemented has been great, but I will say that I feel like when it comes to these recent new rules, I feel like they've done a pretty good job of implementing rules that don't like hurt everybody in the game, if that makes sense. Like it doesn't hurt the offensive player. It might hurt the defensive player, honestly, sometimes. Like the landing in the shooting area obviously benefits the offensive player, but you don't want someone landing on someone's ankle and getting hurt. So I think that's a reasonable rule. But I'm just saying, like, if anything, it probably hurts the defensive players, but still, either way, I feel like the rules are pretty decent. At least the two I mentioned, I feel like were decent rules to be implemented. So we'll see how this one works out. Like I said, I feel like the rip-through move has decreased every single year. The only players I really associated with is Chris Paul and Kevin Durant. I can't really think of any other players who do this move that often. Because people used to do this all the time, or at least from my memory, I feel like it was happening way more. So like, I'm trying to think who else does this, at least frequently enough that I have a memory of it, because right now I can't think of anybody. You can let me know in the comments down below who else does this all the time besides Kevin Durant and Chris Paul, because I'm drawing a blank. But yeah, so I feel like, this rule might work out pretty well too.